Well, hello, and thank you for taking the time to join us once more in the Map Room, where we are continuing our series of briefings looking at a number of the common issues that we see agency owners facing at this time. And today, we're really going to try and help you understand your positioning. And to give you some context to that, we hear the word pivot a lot. I've used it in my own story of pivoting an agency. And we hear lots of people talking about pivots that they took, maybe coming out of the COVID period. And so my question there is, are they intentional? Are they circumstantial? But we want to ask the question today specifically is your positioning appropriate for your business? Is it understood, both maybe internally and externally? And is your positioning giving you, as the business owner, the business you need to lead the life you want? So joining me today as our subject matter expert is Ben Potter. Ben is an advisor around positioning and new business, specifically to the kind of agencies we mostly represent, sub 1 million. So I'm hoping that today his knowledge and passion in this area will be of value to you as our listeners. So first and foremost, Ben, hello, welcome to the Map Room, and thank you for giving your time
Absolutely,
for
yeah,
our
great to be
clients
here.
today.
Thank you for inviting me on, Stuart.
I suppose I should start with the first question. We've mentioned already, maybe there, three of the P's: the positioning, maybe even, the word pivot, and also proposition. And I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But this word positioning, we hear it a lot in the agency space. To you, what does it mean exactly?
I think you're right to firstly raise that as an issue. I do think we're very good in agency land in coming up with various different words, phrases, acronyms, etc., that can create some degree of confusion. And I suppose it's sort of quibbling over the semantics. It might seem a little bit petty, but I do think it's quite important we get this right so that the rest of this conversation makes sense. So the way I see it is that positioning is your business strategy. So it's what you do. It's who you do it for, and it's how you do it. Your proposition is then how you communicate that externally to the outside world so that it is relatable and hopefully attractive to your target audience. The analogy I like to use is the one of marriage. I've used this one for a long time. Positioning is deciding who you're going to marry. Proposition is how you go about asking the question. So hopefully your future spouse says yes. So that's the easiest way for me to try and kind of communicate the key difference between the two.
Okay, excellent. Well, hopefully that will help people understand in an analogy the difference between positioning and proposition. So, taking it from either of those positions, what do you see as the common pitfalls that are facing agency owners today? What's the common issues you see with agency positioning?
This is pretty timely. I've been conducting a number of positioning reviews over recent months, and it's kind of a lighter touch version of a full repositioning project. It's typically for agency owners who kind of feel like they've done some of the hard yards to get their positioning to a decent place, but are looking for some validation and perhaps some ideas on how they could take it further. So I literally published an article yesterday highlighting some of the pitfalls and the mishaps that I'd spotted. I think the most obvious one, which has been a problem for years and years and years, is this kind of tendency to try and be everything to everyone. The classic kind of full service agency working with everybody from SMEs to global organizations. That's not an exaggeration. That's how an awful lot of agencies sort of try and position themselves. So I think the biggest mistake, and what I believe is actually a fundamental strategic failure on behalf of those agencies, is to try and be everything to everyone. And I always find that slightly ironic when those agencies also offer strategic services to their clients. It doesn't look great, does it, when actually they're not able to kind of fulfill some of the basic rules of strategy themselves. So I think that's always the biggie, trying to be everything to everyone. What I've observed in recent weeks, having conducted these reviews, is not necessarily putting a discipline label. So when I think of positioning, I think of it as this kind of three-legged stool. It's what you do, it's who you do it for, and it's how you do it. And the what you do, first and foremost, is about being really clear in what is your core discipline. So are you a digital agency, a design agency, a creative agency? And the reason why that's important is because buyers will tend to pigeonhole agencies according to one of those disciplines. And I think this is becoming even more important as people, as I've heard and seen, are starting to go to ChatGPT, for example, and that's how they're starting their research for new agencies. ChatGPT, give me the top 10 creative agencies in Manchester, for example. So it's really, really
Yeah.
important that there's a really clear label on what is the core discipline of that agency. And what I've seen recently is that isn't always the case. And if it doesn't smack you in the face the moment you land on that agency website, and it isn't clear to buyers exactly what you do, then there's a high likelihood it creates confusion, and therefore they leave. So making sure you're really clear on what you do is important. But then in terms of how we frame what we do, typically what agencies will tend to do is they talk an awful lot about services. They put services front and center of their proposition. Now, fundamentally, services are just a vehicle that get a client from where they are now to where they want to be. More fundamentally, a client has a business problem or challenge they cannot address. And as I say, the services are just the means to address that. See often enough is going to an agency website and then highlighting the 3 or 4 core high value business problems that they can specifically address and are uniquely placed to address for those clients. And therefore, what we start to do is reposition our services as solutions. Now, this gets into a whole other conversation about service design, about productization. We'll probably touch on some of that today. But I think putting services ahead of problems and solutions is another kind of recurring theme I tend to see. And then I think it's just the language. I wrote an article years ago for eConsultancy around sort of buzzword bingo and all these words that agencies tend to use on their websites, like transparent, like passionate, honest, all of those
Innovative.
things. And I could
Yeah.
republish that article today and it will probably get just as much traction as it did back in 2018. We haven't moved on from a lot of those kind of unsubstantiated claims. I think a lot of these things are table stakes. You know, if a client's going to work with you, the minimum they're going to expect is a certain degree of transparency. They're going to expect honesty. They are going to expect a certain amount of passion from your team working on the business. So these are not points of difference. Maybe way back when they were, but they're certainly not now. So I often see these buzzwords, these cliches, if you like, kind of masquerading as points of difference, and they're really not. They're really not. So that's just 2 or 3, but there are.
That's really interesting, Ben. And that takes me back to when I'm not from the agency space, although I did build and sell to agencies. Before that, I was not in the agency space. And one of the things that got me into that agency space was, why was it perceived to be so different? I'll come back to that in a minute. But something that there was a long-standing friend of mine was a buyer at a large international brand. And I was asking him about, agencies and the role of agencies. And it was fascinating what he said there, which is he had a very clear perception of that agency, what they were good at, what they were bad at. And what he said was, one of the challenges he faced was, he used to play a little naughty game, which was to ask people, let's just say you're a web design company, can you also build it? And then the minute somebody said, oh, yes, we can do that as well, probably through a fear of losing that client, he used to downgrade them, because what he really liked was people to say, no, that's not our specialism, because he believed he'd bought a specialist, and that was one thing. I also think what you've said there is not necessarily unique to agencies, but you're saying there about the problem solving. I often say this, which is at MAP, we will say that we look after digital and creative agencies. And I often ask the question, which is, what's a creative agency? Because I don't believe any buyer said, my problem is creativity. And my problem is I need to sell more widgets, or I need to do something. I need to rebrand my brand. And then they need a creative to come up with some ideas. But it comes back to that point of, nobody buys a drill, they buy a 20 millimeter hole in the wall. So I do find that incredible. Come back to sort of the agency space, because as I said, coming from outside of that space into it, I see lots of these issues as fairly generic, and I would suggest that positioning is a generic issue across lots and lots of sectors. But why do you think some of the pitfalls you're talking about there, or you see, are specific to agencies?
I think probably one of the most fundamental things that perhaps is slightly different in our space is that if you imagine a sort of a creative director who's also, say, the MD of an agency, so they're looking after new business. I think by the very nature of that kind of creative, kind of entrepreneurial spirit, there is always a belief that they can almost turn their hand to any problem. And what that often means is that instead of, to your point, saying no to things, there's always this temptation to go, well, yeah, we can do that. Yeah, we can fix that problem. Or, yeah, we can create a new service on the fly just because a client's asked for it. Why can't we do that? So I often think it's down to that kind of that kind of creative entrepreneurial spirit, an unwillingness to kind of maybe say no, or sort of potentially sort of disappoint a prospective client. So I think that's a big thing. I think when it comes to sort of the process of narrowing positioning, I think one of the reasons why it doesn't happen and why you still see an awful lot of agencies that are very generically positioned in the way that we described earlier on, we kind of do everything for everyone. I think it's often a fear of missing out. And I think agency owners are
Yeah.
often more frightened by what they may lose, as opposed to thinking what they may gain by being more specialist, by being more niche, by narrowing their focus, for example. So there is that kind of fear of missing out, and I do think that is particularly at the moment in the current climate. It's not easy out there by any stretch of the imagination. It hasn't been for a number of years. It's been kind of one thing after another, after another, after another. So I think that kind of plays into that fear even more so, that if we kind of narrow our focus and we sort of only do this thing for this type of client, is that sustainable in the current climate when opportunities seem to be fewer and further between? Now, there is a counter argument to that, which I'm sure we'll come on to in a few moments' time. And I think the
Yeah.
final thing is just cobbler's shoes. It's all very well saying that we're very good at delivering strategy for our clients and we deliver marketing campaigns, etc., etc. But often an agency just doesn't have the time, the space, sometimes the inclination to do enough of those things internally themselves. They're busy at work with their clients and just can't find the time to actually sit down and look at what they're doing internally to drive their business forward. So yeah, there's three or four things which are maybe one or two of those aren't necessarily unique to agencies, but I certainly think the first of those is probably quite unique to a creative business, is that kind of entrepreneurial spirit that I referred to earlier.
That does make a lot of sense. And I agree with you particularly over the last few years. I think there has been a fear of chasing the orders, fear of chasing, I'm going to say, next month's payroll, and we do see lots of instances where the agency allows itself to get dragged off track slightly because of that. You choose your phrase, fear of missing out, or whatever it is. I suppose very often we will see at MAP sometimes the consequence of this. So we will see a dip in revenue or an increase in costs or whatever. And obviously we are often, as the accountants or the outsourced finance function, we're looking at some historics. But if we wanted to look sort of forward and maybe put this issue on the radar, what kind of symptoms might a poorly positioned agency be experiencing at this time before it gets too bad?
If we think about it in terms of, I suppose, two key areas: lead generation, firstly, creating the right kind of opportunities, and then we can have a look at maybe the sales process, and then actually a third area would be the sort of commercial impact on the agency. From a lead generation point of view, probably if you are very generically positioned, again in the way that we perhaps described earlier, it's very, very difficult to create a marketing or a lead generation plan, whatever you want to call it, when you are effectively trying to target everyone. It is in fact impossible. I've tried many years ago. Where do you start? Where do you start when you are trying to create a marketing plan where you are effectively targeting everybody from, local SMEs through to kind of global organizations? It's pretty much impossible. So I think the first symptom you may experience is difficulty in either putting together a plan or perhaps not really having a plan at all. And the result of that is you probably try a bit of everything, as we tend to do. The shiny new toy comes along and it's right, well, let's give TikTok a go. Let's give this a go. Let's give that a go. And you tend to find that very few of those things, if any, actually work. So your patience threshold around investing in channels, activities, tactics is very, very low. And I see that all the time. An agency owner might, or a marketing manager might say, right, we're going to do an event. And they run that event and they don't get any leads from it. So they go, well, that didn't work, did it? And actually, when you are well positioned, the clarity you have around what you should be doing, and your investment in the right kind of activities becomes much, much clearer. And it should also mean that you're prepared to give those activities longer to ensure that they work. Because the reality is, if you run one event, you're very unlikely rather, to generate any leads straight off the back. So I think from a marketing point of view, that's probably the biggest thing you're going to see, is a difficulty in creating a plan and executing a plan on an ongoing basis with any degree of consistency. In terms of the sales process, it's likely to be one-sided. the power dynamic is probably going to be in favor of a prospect, because ultimately, if
Yep.
you are a generically positioned agency, there's another 20 of you around the corner. They can always find somebody that's going to be able to do that work more cheaply. And therefore, it becomes much more of a price-driven exercise, typically speaking. Unless maybe they've been referred to you and you've got a good recommendation, maybe that kind of negates that slightly. But if somebody's out there doing their research, shortlisting 5 or 6 agencies, and they're all broadly positioned in the same way, i.e. generically, it probably becomes more of a price-driven exercise. And that affects the power dynamic, not just once they become a client, but it's actually determined much, much earlier. It's during the sales process that that power dynamic is established. I think a lot of people think that, you know, by giving away a little bit of power during the sales process, they'll be able to get it back once they become a client. That very rarely happens, as we all know. If somebody buys on price and they buy on time and inputs, that's going to dictate the relationship that follows once they become a client.
Totally.
In terms of kind of things like win rate, I would typically say that a poorly positioned agency is probably converting 20-25% of their proposals into wins. And they're having to kind of do more pitches, probably 5 or 6, 5 or 6 losses for every win. So there's an awful lot of time and resource that goes into trying to win one new client. So there's a huge amount of waste there actually that's going into just get one client over the line. There's 4 or 5 you're working on that don't necessarily come through. Commercially, you're probably seeing a downward trend in margins. If you look at the recent bench press report, the last 2 or 3 years actually, margins have been on a downward trend, both gross and net. And I think if you are a generically positioned agency, you're probably feeling that more than most. The opposite can be true of a very, very well positioned agency that can probably increase their pricing justifiably, and therefore can increase their margins. Commercially, I think it's probably most evident in your profit margin and whether that is on a downward trend or not.
Definitely. I mean, again, going back to our role in this, we see that those agencies that are very clear, and we maybe will talk about, I don't want to say niche at this point in time, but as you say, are not trying to be all things to all men. They are maintaining stronger profitability. They may not be, some of them are smaller, but I always say it's the profitability to me that is my interest. I think this comes back to a few, I want to go back to a few things you've said there that really resonates with me. Having come from a very different industry and then into this space, is, as you said there, I often talk about the fact that lots of agencies were created as a vehicle to bill a craft. So somebody was a designer or they were a software engineer or whatever. And it's that principle that's maybe led the sales process at the start. But because they're not, maybe haven't taken the time, or they believe they're not a salesperson, inverted commas, they don't have the confidence or the discipline to have that plan in the first place. And so they're very reactive. And you said a few things there that I see happen a lot. One is they believe the price of something has changed or become down because the market's allowed it to happen. So they don't trust them or back themselves to have value pricing. That's maybe a separate conversation another day. But your point there about the activity and where you should be spending your money and giving it time is a really clear one. You know, for example, Paul speaks at a specific event down south every year. And this year, you know, MAP has signed one of their largest ever new business clients as a result of that 3 years in. And it wasn't that Paul said something overtly different this time. It was just that repetition of the proposition and the positioning. Specifically for us, you know, part of our argument and debate about positioning is where do we start and where do we stop? And we're very clear of our role in the entrepreneur's journey. And I think that's something that I see a lot in the agency space. And it's probably more to do with the personality and the history of the owner than it is about the buyers. But yes, that bit that says, well, I need to do this, or I need to drop my pricing. And I totally agree with you. The minute so many people, I've done it, and so many people continue to do it, they'll discount that first opportunity, that first project with that client.
Absolutely
they
not.
never get that
No,
price back.
you can't expect to price
we
low
know
in that
is
way and then increase your prices later on,
no,
because the
no,
buyer is accustomed to that lower price and that's how they perceive you. So very rarely does that idea of, you know, sell it cheap initially and then increase your prices later on. Very rarely see that work.
We mentioned briefly there the concept of niche. And again, we often say that the evidence that we see at MAP is those agencies that specialise, therefore, for me, specialising is in a niche, tend to have greater profitability. Now, that might be to do with the kind of clients we take, that might not be as broad. But what's your view on niche or specialising? What's the positives? What's the negatives?
So yeah, I mean, I suppose to refer back once again to a stat from the Wow Company and their bench press report. If we're gonna look at sort of the commercial impact of niching, of specialization, there was a fantastic stat that came out of their last bench press report, and it was as follows: you are twice as likely to achieve fast growth, and that's an increase in fee income of plus 26%, and high profitability, that's a gross profit of plus 61%, if you have a clear specialism or niche. So if we look at it purely from a commercial point of view, in terms of margins, it has been shown that specialization or niching has the impact of improving margins. And that's really, really important because, again, looking at those bench press reports, it's typically said that, a good net margin for an agency is 20%. If you're doing above that, you're doing really well. The average, I think, has come down to about 14%, according to the Wow Company bench press report. And it's
Yeah,
in
I would echo
decline.
that.
And that is not sustainable. An agency cannot sustain margins when they start dipping down towards 10% and lower. So commercially, again, if you want the biggest, shiniest benefit of all, ultimately it will come down to money and how much money there is in the bank as a result of those margins. But in terms of other, I suppose, benefits, if you like, of why you might niche, of why you might specialize, culturally, I think is really important. You will
Yeah,
attract both the right kind of clients who share your way of thinking, for example, but also importantly, you're attracting the right kind of talent who resonate with your positioning. So if you are a specialist within a particular sector or a specialist at solving a particular problem for a particular type of client, you're going to ultimately attract similar types of people that want to be a part of that. So culturally, there's a benefit. Going back to some of our points earlier, there's greater clarity from a marketing point of view, where and how you spend your money. That all becomes much, much clearer. It becomes clearer which events you should go to, what you should be speaking about, what you should be writing about, and so on and so on. Sales process wise, it's almost the opposite of all the things we said earlier. You have greater leverage in the sales process. So you should at
yeah,
least be able to lead or influence that sales process in a way that you might not necessarily be able to do if you're one of 10 agencies who are all very kind of generically positioned and part of a
yeah.
pitch process. Win rate, in terms of win rate, I referred earlier to, in my view, poorly positioned agencies, I typically see converting at, you know, 15, 20%. I believe a well positioned agency should be converting at about 60 to 70%. Um, and that isn't
Okay,
just,
interesting.
I think it's a really important point to make here. That isn't because they're better at pitching. It's not because they have better pitch decks
No.
or they turn up to a pitch meeting and they do the jazz hands and all of that kind of stuff. What is actually because of they are better at qualifying at the beginning of the process because they have a really clear idea
Absolutely.
of what their ideal client look like. The website, for example, might work harder for the agency at qualifying before you even have a conversation. So people will come to the website and go, either these guys look interesting, they could be for me, or the opposite, they come to the website and go, well, we don't fit that kind of profile of client. We haven't got that problem. We're not an e-commerce brand, for example, so we won't even contact that agency. But then when it gets to the actual qualifying conversation at the start of the sales process, you've got a really clear framework as to who fits and who doesn't. So it makes the sales process more efficiently. So you are effectively pitching less to win more, if you like, which means your kind of whole new business objective is all about winning a few better quality clients rather than having to win lots of, say, smaller ones where, because there's quite a lot of churn through the agency, you have to kind of keep refilling the pot because you're losing clients. And that makes the whole new business process a great deal more difficult. And then in terms of client relationships, well, because you're working with more similar types of clients, it becomes more efficient. You can start to think about things like productization, standardizing your delivery model, less stress for
Yeah.
staff because they're not having to kind of make stuff up on the fly or learn a new industry from scratch because they've never worked in banking, for example. But hey, we've just won a banking client. Fantastic. Well, we've got no experience there,
Yeah.
but okay, let's give it a go. So I think from a staff and culture point of view as well, that's another point to add earlier. And I suppose
I
Yeah.
often see, just jumping on that one, I often see we talk about, and you must see this, and I'm sure it's one of the reasons lots of people speak to you and get your input and your advice is this thing of, Paul and I spoke about it recently, where the principal they look to grow the business, and therefore the principal or the owner says, okay, I'm no longer going to be doing the selling, and I'm going to get somebody in. And we hear of so many stories, and we know sometimes the same candidates who go round the wheel 6 months at 180, 12 months, whatever. And I've seen it so many times where they wonder why the new business salesperson hasn't succeeded. And one of the reasons being is they're out there because the proposition's not clear, or the positioning, I should say, is not clear. They're out there thinking exactly that. Why is a banking client different to a utilities client, for example? And when they bring it back in, it creates such an issue in the delivery and in the project management team or the design team, because it's like, well, we don't know about this, and the confidence dries up. The experience isn't great, and somebody says, I told you shouldn't have done that. So instead of taking that time at the start to, as you say, look at it, and you mentioned it version at the start, which was I'm a big believer in, which is sometimes the greatest strategy you can have for your small business is to understand just when to say no. So all those things I've seen it happen. If we talk about the positioning there, and you've spoke about a few things there about, your sales process, even about what you say, where you say it, the audience that you pick. Are there options that someone can look at? So if I'm looking at myself and my agency, and I can understand maybe what I'm doing or maybe what I'm not doing very well, but what kind of, it's very easy for you or I to sit here and say, your sales qualification at the start must be clearer, and I think that's a massive issue, because people are chasing things that are not appropriate and burning cash and time doing so. But what kind of different positioning options could I consider if I was a small agency today?
Broadly speaking, there are two main options. You either, and this is stuff that I picked up over the years from people like, say, David C. Baker. If you haven't read The Business of Expertise, I'd advise any small agency owner, or medium or large agency owner, in fact, to read that book.
Repeat that.
The
Apologies, Ben, for
Business of
people in case they
Expertise
didn't
by
catch that.
David C. Baker. So yeah, please go
David
and read
C.
that book.
Baker.
And if you don't listen to his podcast with Blair Enns, another big influence on my thinking, the Two Bobs podcast, go and read that. So go and listen to that rather. But David talks about there being, broadly speaking, there are kind of two positioning options, if you like. There's vertical positioning, and that's typically a sector. So we are going to focus on the banking sector. And we're going to do that because over the years, we've worked with a number of clients within banking. We wouldn't consider ourselves necessarily to be experts as yet, but we've got enough credibility whereby if we were going to specialize in that space, we could build a viable business. Just to add to that, you've also got to kind of really enjoy banking, for example. So whatever sector you may choose, you've got to enjoy doing it, and there's got to be a commercial opportunity for you in there as well. So first of all, we've got vertical, which is going after a particular of a sector. The other option is horizontal. So you can work across a number of different sectors, but maybe there is a particular problem that exists across those sectors, or perhaps an opportunity that you can work with your clients to help exploit. So broadly speaking, there are kind of two main options. However, if you go back to my kind of three-legged stool analogy that I kind of referred to earlier, what you do, who you do it for, and how you do it, when you actually start to think about it in that way, the list of combinations is almost endless, if you like. So in terms of what you do, I spoke earlier about you have to have a core discipline, and then you will probably have a series of services that sit under that. Ideally, you'll start to think more about the solutions you provide, not just a shopping list of services. And those solutions are aligned to addressing particular problems. You've then got who you do it for. So target audience, as I said, that could be vertical, that could be horizontal. Then you've got the how piece. So the how is of point of difference over other agencies that might be positioned in a similar kind of way. So inevitably, if you say we are going to be a creative agency for the banking sector, so you've got those first two legs of the stool nailed down. But then in terms of how you deliver your work, you're probably going to have something quite unique in your thinking, in your insights, in a methodology, in a particular perspective or point of view you may have, a pricing methodology, your use of technology, your use of AI. I think we're about half an hour in, and that's the first time we've said AI. But so that third leg is your potential point of difference compared to agencies that may also be focused on creative for banking. So when you start to think about it in that kind of three-legged stool analogy, as I said, the combination within those three options is I wouldn't quite say endless, but you can get pretty creative with this stuff as to how you define your audience in particular and the differentiator that.
Really interesting.
Mm.
You have mentioned AI there, so let's bring the beast into the room. And you mentioned at the start that very often you're finding, or we can all see evidence of where somebody is, maybe from the buyer side and also from the seller side. Agencies are doing research into this, and we mentioned Chat GPT. What do you see the role of AI in this space? And positive and negative. I think there's depending who you speak to, there's lots of people who fear it. There's lots of people who are gravitating towards it for different reasons. But specifically in your expertise, so positioning in agencies, talk us through what you see as the opportunities and maybe the areas of concern with AI.
So what I've seen so far is there are some agencies who are specifically positioning themselves as experts in AI, which I think is perfectly credible. So they are working with businesses to help them navigate this new world through workshops, training, etc. So you are starting to see agencies popping up who are specifically positioned around being AI experts. My only slight concern with that is I don't believe anybody is an AI expert. It's too new. We're too early. It changes literally by the day. I think it's very difficult to kind of position yourself as an absolute expert in something when it's so new to market. But that's a side issue. What I'm tending to see from agencies who aren't necessarily positioning themselves as absolute AI specialists is probably too many slightly broad, unsubstantiated claims about using AI, but not being really clear with how it's being used and the value that will bring to their clients. So people are just sticking AI on the website because it's a shiny new toy and shit, we better let everybody know, our clients and prospects, that we're on this AI thing, but without really kind of sharing exactly how they're on it. And then I look at AI in terms of how it's being used in agencies and therefore the effect it may have on your positioning. And I think there are two layers to that. First of all, we all know that AI has the potential to drive internal efficiency. So it has the potential to allow you to deliver the same work to your clients, but faster. But actually, the outcome or the output of the deliverables are exactly the same, but you can just do it 50% faster, for example. Now, if that is what you're doing, I think you probably have to keep those gains quiet, because if you don't and you start talking about we deliver the same work, faster, more efficient, inevitably the client's going to go, well, you're going to have to lower your fees then. The more exciting part of how you use AI is using ChatGPT and other tools to develop products, services, tools that don't just deliver the same quality of work, but actually deliver much, much better work, better outcomes for the client. And if you're able to do that, then you can start to think, well, actually, we can not only use AI to deliver work potentially more efficiently, we can also use AI to deliver work more effectively that delivers better strategic outcomes for our clients. But actually, we can also charge more for that because we've invested the time to learn the technology, to build these tools or to build these products that deliver better transformational outcomes for our clients. And therefore, there's a greater value to that. So we don't have to drop our prices. If anything, if we build these tools and products, we can actually potentially increase our prices as a result of that.
It's fascinating. You've used an example there, which I have seen recently, where, and to clients who will remain anonymous, their confidence around that, which is using AI to deliver a traditional design and build style service to a client, assumed, therefore, the client would seek to pay less. One assumed it was a chance to rip up the old rate card and introduce value pricing. I can tell you the one that's gone for value pricing, because I think they truly understood that the client was buying that outcome at the first. They were buying that outcome and they had a price prepared to pay for it. Is making a lot more money today. And the other client who has decided that AI is a chance to do it faster, but become more competitive in the marketplace, I've struggled with it. Fascinating conversation, but I am conscious of time. Let's move on to so people are resonating with it and they say, yeah, I can hear all that and maybe we are doing that. And very often it is about coming back out the mud and being clear and putting your head above the parapet and being clear about your positioning and all the things you've said. How should agencies approach the process of positioning and or repositioning?
Great question. I think first and foremost, kind of going back to your sort of point that you just alluded to there, I think first and foremost, you've got to ask yourself the question, do we actually have a positioning problem? Let's be really, really honest with ourselves internally. Let's listen back to some of the symptoms that you and I were talking about earlier on. To what extent do they resonate? Maybe they don't. Maybe you're absolutely flying. Maybe your margins are where they need to be, and so on and so on. Because there are always exceptions to the rule. I think it's really important to caveat that there are some really poorly positioned agencies doing really, really well, that fly against everything I've spoken about today. Few and far between, and they will have something else going on in their business that means they're almost able to break the rules, as it were. So I've seen a Nottingham-based agency, for example, who offer, and I've been following this for a while, I've met them a few times, they offer the full myriad of digital marketing services and they work across any sector. They break all the rules that I've spoken about today in terms of what good positioning looks like, but they've grown their business exponentially year on year. And the reason why they've done that is because they've taken sales seriously from day one, and they have built a first-class sales function within their agency. But that is very rare. You don't see that. So I think it's important to make the point that the symptoms that I spoke about earlier on, if you are experiencing those, it doesn't necessarily mean you are well positioned or poorly positioned. There are grey areas in between. But I think you first of all got to be really, really honest with yourself and say, look, do we think we might have a problem around our positioning? Do some of those symptoms resonate? Let's sit down as a senior leadership team and have an open, honest conversation about where we think we are. Because if you don't think you've got a positioning problem, you're not going to come knocking on the door of people like me for help. I think that's where you need to start. And there are three questions I think you can kind of ask of yourselves. And this is kind of almost when I go through a positioning project or a positioning review, by the end, we want to be able to say yes to these three questions. Now, these are begged and borrowed from a really, really good strategist that I suggest everybody follows called Alex M.H. Smith. And he's kind of on a mission to kind of make strategy more straightforward to kind of understand, if you like. You know, there are so many books on this subject. It's so confusing for many. Most of us don't really understand what the word strategy actually means, even though we plaster it all over our websites. But these questions I've slightly amended for the agency space. So if you were going to look at your positioning right now, these are the three questions that I would ask of yourselves. Is your current positioning important and therefore relevant to prospects, thereby making your agency highly desirable to a discrete target audience? Number two, is your positioning unique to you? So thereby, is it leveraging your unique characteristics? Is it leveraging your interests, passions, your experience, and your true strengths as people? And number three, is your current position defensible rather, versus the competition? So ideally, we would love our positioning to be in a place whereby you are the only agency who do X, i.e. your discipline, for what your target audience, using Z, that point of difference, that differentiator. So ideally, that's where we would like to be, the only agency doing this. Now, that is very, very difficult. I'm not saying that's easy, but ideally that should be where we're trying to get to. So I would start by, as I said, just to summarize, do you have a positioning problem? And accept that you may do, and then maybe test that against those three questions that I just referred to there.
I would also suggest if somebody took those three questions, I think the risk is we're all guilty of them, specifically entrepreneurial mindsets that tend to be more optimistic than pessimistic, and recognizing, do we have a problem is often hard, isn't it? But I suppose the other way of doing it is one of the things we do work with is looking at risk mitigation, is identifying that risk. So if you could also ask those same questions, which is look at yourself from the outside in and say, do we think we can see, are we unique? What's the threat to us not being unique? Those three questions are great. And they could be used that way again to look at it, because the risk is, guess what? Most business owners love their business. Like, the old, love your children, and you don't see faults very often. So I think another way of doing it is looking at it and saying, okay, how could we demonstrate that our offering is unique? How could we demonstrate that this? And that would be another way of doing it. So that's the sort of questions that somebody needs to be asking of themselves. And that's as much about helping them understand if they have a positioning
Yeah.
problem, which is a great way of looking at it. If somebody goes down this route and somebody repositions, two questions there. What does the journey look like?
Yeah.
How hard is it? How long does it take? And what does the outcome? What's the promised land look like? And how would
Okay.
I know I'd got there?
I'll take the first of those questions. I think it's really important for people to understand when you reposition your agency, it is far from an overnight process. So you're effectively going from version 1.0 to version 2.0, and that takes time. So the way I have to describe it is that when you reposition your agency, it's kind of half reality and half ambition. It's half reality because you've chosen to go in a particular direction because you have got some experience and some expertise in that chosen space and you've got a genuine interest in it. Otherwise, why would you have chosen to reposition in that way? But it's half ambition because you haven't got a full client roster of clients fitting that new positioning. You're not absolute experts in that new niche or that new sector, or particularly solving that particular problem for a number of different companies across a number of different sectors. You've almost got to kind of work towards that. Now, when I was involved in repositioning an agency I worked with or worked for down in Brighton many years ago, we went from a small agency working with lots of different types of SMEs in and around Brighton and further afield. So effectively the generically positioned agency I referred to earlier, to specialising in working with kind of premium e-com and retail brands. Because we work across quite a few of those types of brands. So we updated the website, updated the messaging, highlighted those logos, etc. And being a lot younger and a lot more naive, I kind of thought, well, as soon as we do that, the door will come knocking. We'll have leads banging down the door that will fit that new positioning, and it will be really easy from a new biz point of view. The reality is that process from when we repositioned to when I could confidently walk into a room with a prospect, with all the client logos, with the case studies, with the insights, with the stories, etc., was a couple of years. And I don't want to say that to put people off, but it's just, and it depends on how far you're going with your repositioning. Is it a complete change from where you are now to where you're going? I mean, it probably shouldn't be too dramatic because positioning isn't something you just make up. You don't go from one thing to another and you just go with it because there's a market opportunity. It's got to lean into what you enjoy doing, what you want to do, where your interests lie, where you've got some experience and expertise. It isn't just something you make up. But that journey could take a year. It could take 18 months to go from where you are now to where you want to be, because it does and should require tangible change across pretty much every part of your business. If it doesn't, then you probably haven't pushed yourself far enough. It's going to impact.
And how do you know when you've got there?
Hopefully, you'll start to realise some of the benefits that we've spoken about earlier on and some of the symptoms that we alluded to. Hopefully, you're experiencing fewer of those. So hopefully, you do start to get more better on-profile leads knocking on your door because of your great content and great thought leadership you're putting out there, because you've got greater clarity about what you should be talking about. Hopefully, you're less reliant on referrals because you've got a really good marketing plan that's working and driving the right kind of opportunity. Hopefully, you've got a bit more leverage in the sales process. You're not having to pitch and pitch and pitch. You're actually doing fewer pitches but winning more. Hopefully, you can increase your prices justifiably so because you've got that kind of expertise. You're not one of thousands of agencies broadly doing and saying the same thing. Hopefully, you've got a really well embedded team that really bought into where the agency is going, the vision, the mission, all of that kind of stuff. So you've got all the right people on the bus and they're all really kind of sort of in tune with where you're trying to take the business. And commercially, hopefully your margins are not on that sort of downward trend that we referred to earlier. Hopefully, if they have been, you're starting to see those actually go in the other direction because you are able to justifiably charge more and generate better margins as a result of that. So again, it's probably almost the reverse of everything we spoke about earlier on. You are now starting to see that within your agency. But again, it won't be overnight. It will be small steps and it will take time.
I think you started this conversation about a plan, and that spoke about a sales plan. I think this also needs a plan. Obviously, we're biased at MAP about the concept of a map and the concept of a plan. Hence why we're in the map room today. But it is also about understanding and being realistic about how long it will take. And in my experience, most people don't give it enough time. But also, lots of people get partway through and go, oh, this is good enough. I've just done this, and actually the
Yeah, and I
rewards
think I
could be
think that's
so
really
much
been
better.
highlighted in the. I mentioned earlier that I've been doing a number of positioning reviews in recent months, and in all cases, the strategic decisions taken by those agency owners were broadly sound. What they hadn't done, to your point, is take it far enough. So when you actually then had a look at how it was being
Mm.
kind of communicated externally, they could take each of their three legs on that stool a little bit further. So, for example, the point of difference, one agency had this really interesting, potentially polarizing point of view, but it was really underplayed and it was almost mentioned in passing. And I was like, right, hold on a minute. We've got something here that you should be turning
Yeah.
the dial up to 11 on this, be the core pillar of your content strategy. You should be out there talking about this and banging the drum again and again and again. So I think you're absolutely right. Often an agency, if they do it themselves, will take it to a certain point, but then they'll kind of default back to the safe place of, well, we're taking it this far. This will kind of do for now, but we don't want to take it too much further for various reasons, probably fear. My job often is
Yeah.
to say no, turn the dial up on everything, go to market with this. It will pay dividends, but it will.
Interesting. And we spoke, as I said at the start of this, about we are addressing certain common repeating issues at the minute. And we had Caroline Canty on talking about that whole thing of, change. People don't go for it because change is difficult. People are frightened of
Yeah,
change. And
yeah.
that whole repositioning, lots of people only go part way. And I'm going to use
Yeah,
sometimes
yeah.
that's where the pivot
The
comes from.
hardest
But
part,
um,
just
I'll,
one
I'll
final
give,
point on this. Sorry to butt in, but I think it's an important point to make.
it's all right.
The hardest part in the positioning process is not necessarily the decision of how you reposition. As I kind of mentioned earlier, that it should be quite an organic process. You're leaning into your interests, the things you enjoy, where you're making money, where your experience and expertise really lies, etc. That process, whilst it needs some facilitation and it needs some alignment with the leaders of that agency, if they're more than one person, they've all got to be on the same page. But with the right process, the right questions, the right facilitation, that bit isn't actually that difficult. The most difficult part is what comes after. It's following through and fully living and breathing it. And to your point earlier on, it's really difficult to say no. At some point, you're going to have to start saying no to opportunities because they don't fit. You probably won't do that on day one because you've still got to keep the machine whirring. You've got to have the money coming in. And that's not the point here. We don't go from agency 1.0 to 2.0 overnight. So you're still going to take on work that doesn't necessarily fit the new positioning on day two. But in time, you will take on less and less of that work as hopefully you're winning more of the right clients. But the hardest part is what comes after. It's not the decision, it's what comes next over the next 12 or 18 months to properly bring that.
You said something at the start of this that said there's lots of different versions of strategy, and what does that mean? And the one thing I always say when I did this was the strategy
Yeah,
is the
yeah,
execution. Otherwise, it's just an
absolutely.
idea, it's a pipe dream. And unless everybody's doing that every day, you are not
Completely.
living that strategy. The best example I can give you on that, Ben, is, and I used the phrase pivot, but I think having spoken to you more, it was a repositioning, is first of all, are you running away from something? Or are you running towards something? And I got involved in a business that was 15 years in, and that business the business owner had lost some fulfillment. And when we asked all the questions, it was, well, this isn't the business I started. And we hear that very, very often. And that was a process. And as I say, it's a simple process, but it's a
Yeah.
difficult to achieve process, which was asking the kind of questions that you said before, but was also looking at it to say, okay, we're going to change this, but also having the belief that changing it was going to cost money. We went into a loss period. But then in the second year, and that's why I echo exactly what you said about timing, it's getting to the end of that first year and going, this didn't work, is what lots and lots of people do. But in my experience, it might not have worked yet. And we carried on and we repositioned that business. And in the second year, we
Yeah,
made more
yeah,
money with less people. And that enabled that owner. I invested in the business. I was a minority shareholder. It allowed that owner to then sell that business because it was also fulfillment. It was all the things that we talk about, getting the life that you want, and that business had been allowed to go in a direction that wasn't it. So the repositioning in that instance was all the things you said.
yeah,
It took longer than we thought. It
yeah,
probably cost a little bit more than we thought, but the rewards when we got there were
yeah,
significant. And it
yeah,
was easy to see. That's my little
yeah.
sort of repositioning story. Give us some brief examples where you can give faith to some people. So give us some good user
I'll give you
stories.
one. It's very front of mind because I bumped into this agency owner at your conference a couple of months ago. So I won't mention their name, but
Yeah.
they're a Manchester-based agency. We did a repositioning project about 3 years ago. They were fairly typical of most digital agencies. They're offering a few different digital marketing services like SEO and PPC and content, and working across quite a few different sectors. So the owner there recognised they had a problem. We worked through the project, which involves a couple of workshops, some research, some validation, agreement on new strategy, writing messaging, and then some recommendations on how they then sort of bring that to life. The output of that project was that they narrowed down to 2 sectors from an awful lot more. So it was a good start. There was some similarities between those 2 sectors. So we managed to kind of craft some messaging, which was a tiny bit clunky, but it just about kind of worked across those 2 sectors. But I think we both knew, both myself and the agency owner, our heart of hearts, that one of those sectors was much, much stronger than the other. And actually what they should have done from the beginning is focus exclusively on that.
Go on
About
then.
3 or 4 months later, I keep in touch and we have conversations. They did exactly that because I think they realised actually we were right all along. We should really narrow our focus and specialise in that particular sector. That sector is property. Now, I bumped into the owner at the event, as I said, a couple of months ago. We hadn't spoken for about a year or so. They've gone from around about 12 people to now 26. I know headcount isn't the be all and end all, but it's a pretty good
It's
signal that
growth.
things are going in the right direction. Everything they now do, from who they recruit to their marketing, to how they manage their sales process, everything is fully focused on the property sector. And you can see it in what they talk about on LinkedIn, their content, the reports they're creating, the clients they're winning is all focused on that particular sector. But interestingly, when you break down property in itself is a massive sector. So there's a lot of
Totally.
subsectors within that. So people are often fearful of, we spoke earlier about, well, if we narrow our focus, it limits opportunity. What they're finding is it's creating more and more opportunity to the extent where they're potentially opening an overseas office, I think, in the States. So for them, it's just, I loved listening to the owner when I spoke to him because he was enthusiastic, he was happy, everything was going in the right direction. And I think it was a real good kind of proof point that if you get this positioning piece right, it yields untold benefits and hopefully negates and addresses some of the downfalls of broader positioning that we spoke about earlier on.
Fantastic. As I say, having lived through it myself, then I totally echo that. I think the things that I would say to people are just be clear, as you say, are you running towards something, you're running away from something? Make sure it's where you want to be, the content of the promised land. It's about fulfillment. We're big believers at MAP that your business has to be the vehicle to give you the life that you want. Don't allow your business to pull you out of shape and all those things, really. So I think everything you've said there is valuable. 2 things you mentioned at the start, an article you wrote, I think you said yesterday. So if people have resonated with this, I always ask the question, how can people find you, Ben? How can they find that article? How can you reach
LinkedIn
out
is the
to
best
you?
place. And search for Ben Potter on LinkedIn.
Okay.
Hopefully I come up somewhere towards the top. So yeah, go and find me on LinkedIn. Feel free to follow or even better connect. I do have a LinkedIn newsletter. I think if you connect, you are automatically subscribed to that. I think. I'm not quite sure how that works, but yeah. So I try and do an article a month and then kind of reuse and rehash that content in different ways. But yeah, the most recent article is about positioning. It's observations around those different position reviews that I've done in recent months. So there's lots of advice and tips in that article, but I talk about a lot. I talk about positioning. I talk about how to build your pipeline, and I talk a lot about the sales process as well. Those 3 things are kind of very much aligned. But yeah, LinkedIn is the best place to find me.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We've run over the concept of these was going to be that they were briefer than the original podcast episodes. But I always say when the conversation flows, I enjoy it. I know having lived what you're saying matters. I also think the concept of the sales process, the clarity of the positioning is actually the symptoms that we're seeing when everyone's telling us they've got pipeline problems. I really thank you for your time. Thank you for everybody who's listened. I hope it's been of value, and we'll see you soon again in the MAP Group. Thanks, and bye for now.